Welcome back to Round the Archives in Conversation. I'm here, Lisa is here.
Hello.
And we're joined by a new voice in the form of Tyler Adams, the brains behind Goon Pod.
The dull-witted loafer behind Goon Pod.
Now, we've been on Goon Pod twice now, which amazes me, considering the calibre of guests you sometimes get on there. So we thought it was about time you did one of these. And
yes, indeed.
I think it'll be interesting because I would guess that you have a very different timeline with television to what Lisa and I might have. Because you're from New Zealand. So Tell us about your early memories of New Zealand telly.
Okay, so I was born in 74. It's really fragmented. My televisual memory is fragmented, and there's just random programs. You know, if I try and think back to what was the earliest shows I can remember, and actually I don't think they were actual kids programs as such, because I remember Chips very vividly. Okay.
Yeah.
I also remember, because my dad was a huge comedy fan, British comedy in particular.
Yeah.
And he would actively encourage me, even at a very early age, to be watching sitcoms. And that's how I got into things like very early, like Are You Being Served, like It Ain't Half Hot Mum, and the like. And also, of course, because we were in New Zealand, there was often a 2 or 3 year lag in terms of the shows that we saw. You know, we would get the latest series of The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin.
Yeah.
Maybe 3 years after it aired in the UK. But one of my earliest TV memories watching it with my dad was the Top Secret Life of Edgar Briggs.
Okay.
All right, yeah.
You better explain what that is.
Yeah, it's David Jason, isn't it? I think he's a spy or something. We do have it. Yeah, I picked it up
that's
on the
right.
network,
I remember loving that. I couldn't tell you. I've not seen it since I was, I don't know, whatever age I would have been, 4 or 5. But I remember loving it because it was just slapstick. It was silly. It was a spoof spy sitcom, and it had David Jason. I subsequently found out that it had your man from Brushstrokes, not Carl Hellman, but the boss from Brushstrokes in it.
Oh, Gary Waldhorn, yeah, from Vicar and Dibley.
It wasn't Ian Dibley, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
Yeah, so Top Secret Life of Edgar Briggs, but yeah. So as I say, a lot of my earliest memories are of what you would call more adult fare. Really.
Yeah.
But I would say, and this is possibly totally inaccurate, but I would say 50%, if not more, maybe 60% of all the telly that I grew up watching was either British or American. There wasn't a huge amount of. There was a fair amount of homegrown television, and also a lot of Australian as well, a lot of Australian telly. But yeah, I suppose the majority of what I watched was British or American, and that's why I get a Proustian rush from things like ITV regional idents, even to this day, particularly Thames, although Thames is so omnipresent even now that you can't get away from that. What's it called? Salute to Thames or something? Is that what it's called, that ident?
Ding, 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 which you can put words to, can't you? Because it's Here They Are Now, Morecambe and Wise.
Or whatever show you're watching.
But your memories are from the sort of late 70s, I would guess, based on your sort of date of birth. Yes. So how many channels did you actually have access to at that point in New Zealand?
Two.
So what was the setup there?
So there was what was it called? Channel 1.
Good.
They focus group that to hell.
Yeah.
Coming up with that. Channel 1 and... What was the other one called? Channel 2, possibly? I can't remember. TV2, I think. Channel 1 and TV2.
Yeah.
And then in the late 80s, we got a third channel. But because I lived in quite a remote part of the country, we didn't actually get that for... until it was sort of early 90s or something. And that was a trashy kind of populist channel, anyway. But Channel 1 was essentially BBC One, or the Kiwi equivalent. And Channel 2 or TV2 was more or less, I suppose, the equivalent of ITV, BBC Two stroke ITV.
Yeah.
It was, although one of the things I do clearly remember growing up is that there were no adverts whatsoever on a Sunday on either channel. But on any other day, there were adverts all the time. Some of my earliest TV memories are of adverts. I guess you guys would be the same, would you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you're very fond of adverts to this day,
I
you,
love
Lisa?
adverts. I can watch a reel of adverts and just carry on watching it.
Just archive
Just
adverts.
archive adverts, yeah.
Yeah.
We've had the odd evening, haven't we, when our
Yes.
friend Warren's been round,
Yeah.
and we've just stuck on YouTube for an hour or two and just dialed up ancient adverts.
Yeah.
So, they are sort of in your consciousness, aren't they, forevermore? They do stick there.
I mean, obviously, there are ones like in this country, particularly things like the Smash adverts and the BT adverts in the early 80s, or whenever they were with Maureen Lipman or Busby, that you remember that you've watched so many times when you were a child.
I know when we did They Came From Somewhere Else on Round the Archives, Nick had an off-air tape of the whole show, and we got terribly excited when there were some advert breaks actually included in the show itself, and because that show's never had a DVD release.
No.
To actually get an off-air copy was like the gold standard for us around the archives.
Yeah. There's obviously, again, it's the more humorous adverts that stick in the mind, and the one I can think of, which may or may not have been an Australian advert originally, but it's promoting a confectionery called Pixie Caramel. And Pixie Caramel was a very, very chewy caramel, chocolate-coated caramel bar. And the premise of the advert is this... I mean, it's thinking about it now, good God, but it's this guy in front of a firing squad, blindfolded, And the sergeant comes up and says, "Any last requests?" And he says, "Yes, a Pixie Caramel, please." And so they fetch this Pixie Caramel, and the condemned man proceeds to eat it, but because it's so chewy, it takes so long to eat, the firing squad, they fall asleep, and he manages to leg it over the wall and escape. That just sticks in my mind.
This rings some bells to me, that I'm sure there must be an advert for another confectionery somewhere that did exactly the same thing. It does sound like a very familiar setup.
Doubt.
So maybe these things are nicked. But from our point of view, Australia was the source for a lot of our archive collections. So when things like Doctor Who and the Goodies weren't being repeated over here, you'd often find somebody with an Australian pen pal and get them to do you tapes. I guess from your point of view, you saw the Goodies all the time too. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. My earliest memory of the Goodies, rightly or wrongly, is the last series, the ITV series.
Yeah.
Particularly, and for some reason, I must have seen it a number of times, and this was well before we had a VCR. But I've got a feeling they must have repeated it at least once, because it was very memorable. And it's the Barbara Woodhouse episode.
Ah,
The
yes.
Goodies.
Yeah.
That was from the last series, wasn't it?
Yes, it's one I'm not that familiar with, because I remember the original transmission of that series on ITV, and I remember audio taping a couple of episodes off air, and the two that I did were Holiday and Bigfoot. So those are the two that I really know.
Yeah, Bigfoot was also one that I remember very fondly. But yeah, I think we got that. So I think that series went out in the UK in, was it 81, 82?
82-ish, I think. Yeah.
And because, as I say, there's that time lag, we probably got it around, I don't know, 84, 85. But absolutely, I remember Saturday mornings, they were repeating BBC goodies all the time.
Yeah.
BBC, around 87, we got a video recorder, and I had a tape from around that time I managed to squeeze, I think, somehow, maybe 6.5 episodes of the goodies onto one tape. And I remember it had... And it was just because it was from just different random series. So it had the John Lemez episode of the goodies, which is on the farm, I think.
Oh yes, yeah.
With the duck pies that walk.
Yeah. Because they're in the they're in the title sequence, and I never knew what episode that was from until very recently.
Yes, yeah. And it had the Dodo episode. It had the Euthanasia, which is very good.
Yeah.
And others, but yeah, so they were repeating that well up into the late 80s, and the Muppet Show as well. Saturday mornings you'd have the goodies, you'd have the Muppet Show repeated all the time. So it was great for me, because I was able to record, as I say, got this video at the end of the 80s or towards the end of the 80s. I was able to record these shows and binge watch them over and over again.
I mean, from my point of view, I think it's the early 90s I got access to maybe half a dozen episodes of the goodies, because they were doing the rounds on UK Gold. But
yeah.
Lisa, when did you get access to non-terrestrial channels? Because I remember you doing Dark Shadows for Paul.
Yeah.
What was that from?
Guess that would be early 90s. Sort of 93, 94.
Yeah, and what channel was that?
I can't remember now. Might have been the Sci-Fi Channel or something like that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Because that's the thing you said about having two channels. I'm ancient enough to remember when Channel 4 came in the UK, and that was terribly exciting to get a new channel. And Channel 4, I guess, is one of those places that really got my interest in old telly, with things like The Avengers, The Prisoner, The Munsters, and The Addams Family all being, basically being fillers for the schedule. But from my point of view, they were the highlights of Channel 4. So, where's your interest in old telly come from? Is it just growing up with these shows, or was there a spark for you about wanting to see old telly?
I don't know. I'd always grown up. I grew up in a very rural town. Well, a very wide open spaces everywhere. It was outdoorsy kind of mentality that I should have. I should have grown up with that mentality. I didn't. I grew up with an indoorsy kind of mentality. I was. I don't know where it came from. I grew up. From my earliest memories are from being obsessed by watching television, being obsessed by comics, and I used to have a weekly subscription to Whizzer and Chips.
Oh yes, I remember Whizzer and Chips. Yes. Yeah,
and again that would be about 6 months late coming, reaching us, and it would never have the cover-mounted gift either. That was, but I know I was obsessed by comics and TV, and to a lesser degree music as well, but and drawing and reading as well. I love reading, so everything I loved doing was more or less kind of solitary or indoors, and there were a lot of repeats of, I guess because there wasn't a lot of homegrown content on TV.
No.
So there were a lot of repeated shows, so I did watch a lot of old, relatively speaking, old shows that were repeated, like things like Steptoe and Son was constantly repeated, Are You Being Served was constantly repeated, and I just developed this real interest in television, and the older I've got, the more I've looked back. But yeah, I guess it's fair to say that British comedy on television was always my number one love. So I remember avidly sitting down to watch, because they'd always be heavily trailed. There's a new British comedy starting on Channel 1, next Thursday. And I'd sit down and watch it, no matter what it was. I remember things like, things that died on their ass, like Dog Food Dan and the Carmarthen Cowboy, Valentine Park, No Frills. Do you remember No Frills with Kathy Staff?
I've heard of it. I don't think I ever saw it.
I'm looking totally blank here, and
Okay.
and Lisa's not much wiser by the sound of it.
Well, these are all either, generally BBC 1 or 2 series sitcoms from the 80s. We would get them all, but as I say, I would watch them just because they were British comedy, and it's carried on thus, and then that's why, because of my love of British comedy on television, I never listened to the radio, and then just by chance one day in the late 80s, I happened to hear on the national radio program an episode of the Goon Show, and that's how I discovered the Goon Show, and that triggered my interest in the Goons, which just became an obsession, and that's why 30 plus years later, I'm doing a podcast about the Goons. But it all stems from that love of British comedy, which was instilled in me by my dad, I guess, and by just watching whatever came on TV, because I would watch everything, because there were only 2 channels. You could more or less watch everything, kind of.
But there's a difference between watching everything and then actually starting to research and collect this stuff. So
yes.
So how soon before you started to build up an actual physical collection of recordings?
Okay, well, I know I've heard some of your guests previously talk about this. Before we had a video player, a video recorder, my favourite shows, I would get the radio tape recorder, and I would sit it in front of the television speaker, put a blank tape in, and record a half-hour sitcom, whatever it may be. I was obsessed by Are You Being Served for a period, and they repeated that regularly, so I'd record quite a number of episodes of Are You Being Served. Wedding Bells, I know off by heart, the episode Wedding Bells, where
so do you, Lisa.
Yes.
Mr. Slocum thinks that young Mr. Grace wants to marry her. I know that off by heart from taping it. I remember taping as well in 1984, because also one of my obsessions was Disney, more significantly or more specifically Donald Duck. I was obsessed by Donald Duck, and I used to collect Donald Duck comics as well. And in 1984, it was the character's 50th anniversary, and there was a American TV special, and it was cheesy as hell, because I have watched it on YouTube subsequently. Cheesy as hell, but I loved it when I was 10 years old, and it was presented by Dick Van Dyke, and I do love a bit of Dick Van Dyke. And I remember recording that off the TV onto the tape, okay, and I would then, using another tape recorder, use clips of Donald Duck talking to pretend I was interviewing him.
Oh, wonderful.
Including bits where my sister had walked in the room and asked me something. You could hear her in the background. But also what I was doing as well, because the Kiwi equivalent or the closest equivalent to the Radio Times was a weekly magazine called The Listener, and that would cover all the TV listings, radio listings, and it'd also be a lot of articles about TV and what was coming up and what the latest shows were and all that. And I would cut out photographs and clips and articles and even TV listings of my favourite shows and put them into scrapbooks. And I was doing that from about the age of probably 8.
I have to say that's not an unfamiliar story from various people that we know. So you're not alone in that, it has to be said.
Yeah.
All right then. What period is peak Are You Being Served for you? Early, middle, or late?
Not late.
Not late.
Oh, let's say right. Not late. Although I am very fond of. I think is it series 10 is the last series with the episode with the robbers. The Swiss Tony episode. You know the one.
Yeah.
You love that, don't
That
you,
is my
Lisa?
absolute favourite episode of Are You Being Served?
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's just so ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, there was a show on recently that looked at a sort of documentary about Are You Being Served, and they were very down on the later stuff. And I was hoping somebody would stick up for that episode,
Yeah.
but nobody seemed to.
No.
You almost wanted to barge them out of the way and wave the flag for that one.
That's great. And also that same series, I think, is the horse racing one where Mr. Humphries is in another department on CCTV.
Oh,
giving
yes,
them the results of the horse race or something.
Yeah, you see, the one I liked from the late period is the where they're doing the radio play on CB radio, and Arthur English is doing all the sound effects with like the kissing noises with a plunger and things like that.
No.
So I have to say there is some good stuff in the later period. I'm guessing, like me though, it's Arthur Brough period that really works for you.
It is. And also my favourite, and maybe not so much now watching them again, but when I was watching them as a teenager or even pre-teen, because I must have got into A being served again around about the age of 8 or something, my favourite character was always Mr. Lucas.
Okay.
I found him, I don't want to say I related to him because I was 8 years old, for God's sake, but but I found him the most amusing. I liked his, because he was cheeky, wasn't he? And also, and I've talked to friends about this, subsequently, but I didn't pick up on that at the time. But it's very interesting, very telling that it's never explicitly made clear that Mr. Humphries is, of the persuasion that he is, but it's very clear that Mr. Lucas is aware of this, and they're great mates.
Absolutely, yeah. I don't think there's any secrets between them.
No.
And they both take each other for what they are quite happily. Yeah, so that is an interesting sort of setup, and it's not necessarily the case in other shows at this time, is it?
No,
yeah.
No. Because there's that thing that we've said before, that Mr. Humphries is the only character in Are You Being Served that everybody gets on with. Nobody ever falls out with him. Really, he just sort of sails along happily, being his best person. Yeah. So
moving on from Are You Being Served, what about things like Dad's Army? Did you get Dad's Army there?
Yeah. Well, it's funny, actually. Tell you what, there's a few what I would call war horses of British entertainment, British TV, that didn't make it so much. Certainly not. It didn't enter my orbit. It may have been. They may have been shown, but I was such a obsessive when it came to British TV comedy that I would have probably picked up on them. But I'd like to say that Dad's Army was never really on when I was growing up.
No.
Likewise, we never really got Only Fools and Horses either.
All right, okay.
Bizarrely.
That's interesting, because there are certain like Eastern European countries where it's absolutely massive. Because didn't Chalice go over to Belgrade? And there's like murals on walls and things like that dedicated to it. So
well, I interviewed Jeffrey Holland for the show, and he was telling me about how not Heidi High but Urang My Lord is huge in Hungary.
Yeah.
The cast are like superstars over there to this day.
Yeah.
There's a show, by the way, a great example of me forcing myself almost to watch whatever was on that was British, because I loved Heidi High. It was never my favourite, but I loved it well enough. And of course, when the news broke that whatever it was, 89 was it, 1990, there was this new comedy show by David Croft featuring stars from Heidi High called Urang My Lord. I was absolutely over the moon, and I watched it, and I think I probably watched every episode, but I didn't. I'll whisper it because I've had Jeffrey on the show, but I didn't really like it that much. But I sort of would watch it, because that's what you did.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know it that well. You know it more than I do. Don't you,
I wonder, because I think it's longer episodes, isn't it? It's not the half.
Yes.
Certainly, the first episode is 45 minutes long, and I wonder whether that's just too long. It crosses from comedy into drama more.
Yeah.
And it does rely again on the catchphrases.
Yeah.
Because you always do it, you know,
that'll be nice.
Yeah. So it crosses over into that sort of, maybe relying on catchphrases too much.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Just on catchphrases, can you... I'm not asking you questions here now.
No, go on.
Okay, catchphrases that have entered the public discourse, if you like, which people still say to this day.
Yeah.
Catchphrases that have come from sitcoms that nobody remembers. Because I'm thinking specifically just the one, Mrs. Webley.
Yes.
You know that, don't you?
I do. And you had never... I can actually see that from where I'm sitting. It's on the shelf on the app.
Right.
And you'd never seen it, had you?
No, I didn't know it at all.
You weren't familiar with it at all. But what I found, Warren and I quote it at each other quite a lot.
Yeah. And I had no idea what you were on about, did I?
Until I showed you, and then you were like, oh, that's where it comes from. So, I mean, it's not the best sitcom ever, but it's obviously stuck in people's minds just to be able to, for that one line.
Yeah.
Really. So.
But then you'll quote things at work, won't you, Lisa?
Yeah, I have to be careful.
And you have to be careful not to offend anyone. It's just the blank looks that you sometimes get.
Yeah.
I mean, do you find this, that you'll start talking about something you assume everybody knows, and in real life, not everybody does?
I can tell you the exact. Well, I can't tell you the date, but I can tell you the exact moment I realised that I was of a certain age and that those around me, or the majority of those around me, weren't. It was whatever year it was. I want to say 2009. 9. I was in the office and news arrived that Tony Curtis had died. And I remember saying out loud, oh God, because I love Some Like It Hot and things like that, you know. So, Tony Curtis has died. And there was this sea of blank faces staring back at me, you know. And I had to say, well, Jamie Lee Curtis's dad. But he was pretty good in his own right, you know. And that was the moment I realised, you know, there is a younger generation, Tyler.
Yeah.
You know.
But I think it's important though to bang on about this stuff, because there is a danger of it being lost, isn't there? And just falling out of people's memories completely. So that's why when you do things like Goon Pod and other podcasts, I think it's hard to get it out to people. But I'm pleased when people do discover this stuff. That's the thing. I think you're doing important work talking about these things. So
God's work. Yeah. If ever I was given the chance to become Prime Minister or World King or whatever it was that Johnson wanted to be, if ever I got the chance to have real power, right? One of the first things I would reinstate would be the death penalty. But it would only apply to people on quiz shows or game shows who use the phrase, that was a bit before my time, I'm afraid.
Oh, I can so sympathise with that.
It's such a lame excuse, because most of human history is before your time.
Yeah.
Yes.
So if you don't look back to things, how do you learn about things?
Yeah.
So
and it compounds the annoyance when they ask a question, they say, and you know what the question may be, I don't know, what would it be? Who was the brother of Mike Winters? Just for example. Oh, that was a bit before my time. It was Bernie Winters. And then they just kind of shrug as if it's not important. Well, it is important. Okay, Mike and Bernie Winters aren't important, let's face it, but it's... You get my point.
Well, the correct answer to that is, oh Christ, there's two of them, but yeah.
Yes. Oh, you've cleaned that up.
Well, I have to. But do you feel that television now is run by people who don't know enough about television?
Well, yeah. Yes. I think, and again, this is possibly totally wrong, I think the rot kind of set in when these list shows began proliferating. And it was like I love the 80s, or I love 1981. I mean, that series, which is probably going back 20 plus years ago that was on TV.
Frighteningly, it is. Yes.
Yeah, and they were, at the time, I remember quite enjoying watching them, because it was kind of before you could just Google everything, or YouTube really took off, wasn't it? So it was a bit like watching Telly Addicts, because you didn't watch it for Noel bloody Edmonds. you watched it for the clips.
Either of them, no.
But yeah, I think that's lazy, and the fact that and then as those shows became more and more commonplace, particularly on Channel 5, and don't get me wrong, actually, I've a lot of kudos to Channel 5, because they're seem to be the only TV channel, or one of the only TV channels that is still promoting old telly, like the Are You Being Served documentary you mentioned earlier, things like that.
Yeah.
But still, these shows where they get talking head celebrities, they play them something, and then they film them saying, "Oh, do you remember when? Do you remember that advert that had the dog on a bike or whatever? What was all that about?"
Yeah.
Just lazy.
I mean, some of these do feel like they've shown them the clip, and then immediately afterwards they've said, "Do you remember that clip we've just shown you?" Basically.
Yeah.
And there's no other context, is there? There's no other knowledge on display here.
No.
Yeah, we hate that phrase, "it was before my time." I think Richard Osman does as well,
He does.
though,
He
doesn't
gets
he, on
really
Pointless?
cross.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I have to say, sometimes you get these editions of Celebrity Pointless, don't you? And I have to say, there are some people in showbiz who are guilty of not knowing about any other showbiz apart from that which they were involved in themselves. So it is a widespread problem, I think. Yeah. So yeah.
One of the things that saddens me as well is I have a friend who works in the industry in television, and it is an unofficial, or maybe it is even now official, that the mainstream TV channels will, maybe with the exception of BBC Two and Channel 4, okay, but it's very rare that you will see a black and white film on BBC One or ITV1 these days. Generally speaking, it's just they all black and white anything, and I just think that's a crying shame, because just because something's black and white doesn't mean that it's not a lot better than some of the stuff in colour.
Talking of black and white, I seem to recall that you've always said you much prefer Steptoe and Son to Hancock's Half Hour. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So what Steptoe and Son got for you that is perhaps not there in the Hancock show?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to which one you saw or heard first, really, isn't it? And Steptoe and Son I grew up with. It was always on, albeit the colour episodes. Yeah. Generally speaking, they would be repeated all the time, including during the day, during the week. That's the other thing. Get home from school on a weekday about 3:30, and on Channel 1 I think there'd be kids programs on Channel 1, and on the other channel there'd often just be films or old sitcoms repeated, which was great, things like Steptoe and Son. But also there'd be repeating TV shows as well from the 70s, like The Lotus Eaters, in the middle of the day. And one of the things that sticks in my mind is that very, very often there'd be a bit of nudity in those, but they'd still be playing them at 3:30 on a Wednesday afternoon. Do you know what I mean? But no, Steptoe and Son I absolutely adored that. And again, it was my dad that got me into that. And my dad used to roar with laughter. I would come to shows before actually watching them, because my dad would quote bits from them or tell me about scenes from these shows. For example, there was going to be a repeat series of The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin sometime in the 80s, and my dad sort of prepared me for this by saying, "You'll absolutely love this. It's a brilliant show." And whenever he thinks of his mother-in-law, he sees a hippopotamus. Okay, and I just thought, wow, my mind was blown by that whole notion. I couldn't believe that. And then he would always, I remember him always talking about the old man in the tin bath, and he's eating pickled onions, and he drops one and fishes around in the water and pulls it out and then eats it. And that's how I discovered Steptoe, really. I can tell you now, I never saw or heard any Hancock until 1985. And the reason I know it so specifically is because 1985 was the 25th anniversary of television beginning in New Zealand.
Okay.
Properly. It was, because we were very late to the party. So it was the 25th. It was a bit like, I suppose it was a bit like the BBC 50th anniversary in 72.
Yeah.
So you had this kind of season or a couple of weeks of special shows and special repeats. And I remember that's actually probably, thinking about it, that's probably where my love of old TV probably really kicked in, because they showed a load of old stuff, and old in 1985, I'm only talking 20 plus years, because I remember they showed the first episode of Coronation Street, which was certainly in the 80s was consistently the number one rated television show in New Zealand.
Okay.
That was the top rated show. Everyone watched Coronation Street, my mother included. But they also repeated an episode of Hancock's Half Hour. Okay, and I remember having never heard the name Tony Hancock up to that point, and I watched the episode. I couldn't tell you which one it was because it didn't stick. I watched it and it just didn't really, it kind of done anything for me, because it didn't stick in my mind, and I certainly didn't go and seek anything out, subsequently. So I didn't see any more Hancock TV for probably another 15 years or more, and I didn't hear any Hancock radio series until probably in the sort of mid 90s, and even then it's never really grabbed me. But Steptoe and Son, all the live long day, I can watch those two, and roar with laughter.
You find yourself doing Goon Pod now, and you're managing to do these on a weekly basis, which is astonishing from our point of view. So, where does the drive to do this come from? And of the 3 or shall we say 4 members of the Goons, what are the showpiece series for you? Not necessarily the Goon Show, but if you wanted to show somebody the genius of these people, what would you show them?
Well, that's a good question. Just on the drive, I find it relatively easy. Not easy, but if I'm interested in something, I can throw myself into absorbing and researching it. And if I enjoy doing something, then it's not a chore. And so I can relatively, not quickly, but the way that my lifestyle is, that I am able to knock out one of these episodes every week, do the research, record it, edit it, get it out relatively easily. Sometimes it can be a bit more difficult if we're talking about a film. If it's a film that I'm not that keen on as well, it can be a bit more of a chore. But I got into podcasting through a couple of friends who had and have themselves a couple of podcasts, and I began doing a few guest spots on those, and then gradually my interest in podcasts developed, you see. And I remember reading some article online about, if you're going to do podcasts, make sure that they're regular, and make sure that they go out at the same time every week or every month, or the same day, and things like that. So I've always had that kind of discipline, or that I've always thought, if I do a podcast, I want to instill that sense of discipline and make sure that it does go out regularly at the same time or on the same day.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess you guys. Does that apply to you?
Not in the
Right.
slightest at the moment.
No.
We when we started out, we were pretty on the spot monthly, weren't we? For various reasons, that began to drift, but we did find that didn't actually seem to affect our actual figures.
No.
So. No. I guess it's, if people like you, they'll find you. But on the other hand, when there is a regular show like yours, I do actually look forward to it coming out. So, yeah, it swings and roundabouts, I guess. It depends on how easy it is to do.
Well, maybe it's just I've got a massive ego, perhaps. I just like the sound of my own voice, and think that other people must as well. Every Wednesday. As for the. So you asked about what would I say if I wanted to show somebody the best of each of the Goons, what would I show them? Yeah. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, so if somebody said, who's Spike Milligan, what would you point them towards?
Blimey. It's hard to say. It's really hard to say with him, because he was over so much different media, wasn't he? TV, obviously radio, books, music, recordings. I think something like the LP Milligan Preserved would be a good starting point. I think that's a consistently excellent comedy album from 61.
Yeah.
That's got some brilliant sketches on it. For Sellers, it would probably have to be... Actually, yeah, I'd say for Sellers, you could point to one of the LPs as well, because Sellers obviously had a number of very successful LPs in the late 50s, comedy LPs. But if somebody said, okay, show me a Peter Sellers film, it would probably it's not my favourite film, it's my second favourite Peter Sellers film, Two-Way Stretch. I think Two-Way Stretch would be a great Peter Sellers film to show somebody. Harry,
I mean, is Harry defined by the Goon Show more than anyone else, do you think?
Yeah, I think he probably is. Yeah. He did. He's done. I did a film. We covered one of his films last week on the show, Sunstruck from '72, which was pleasant enough, but it's not. It's a pretty slight film. Harry's a tough one, I suppose. I'm not going to say Highway. There's a film he made called Davy in 1958, in which it's not necessarily a great film. It's quite a amusing little film. In fact, it was the last Ealing comedy, actually. But Harry's really good in it. He's got some chops. He's really, really good in it. So I might point at that. Maybe one of the Harry Seacombe television specials or something. But it's so. I mean, he's a great chat show guest, isn't he, as well? Yeah. So maybe one of the chat shows. But it's with him. I certainly wouldn't say, right, stick on one of his LPs. No offence to anyone who likes Harry's music, but and Michael Bentine. Well, I tell you what, Michael Bentine's radio series in the 80s, The Best of Bentine, that's consistently excellent.
I don't know that one at all.
Sketch show. In fact, I have talked about this on Goon Pod on a number of occasions, and I will just mention it now because I jotted down, obviously knowing I was coming on and that we were going to be talking about the television climate when I was growing up. I jotted down a list of all the New Zealand TV shows that I could think of, and one of those was an adaptation of a kids' graphic novel, although they didn't call it that in those days. But there was a kids' graphic novel called Terry and the Gunrunners, which must have come out around 83, 84, and I bought it and I absolutely loved it. Used to read it cover to cover all the time, reread it, and they did a kids TV adaptation on TVNZ in around 86, and the reason I mention that is that it was about this young lad who falls afoul of some villains, and you've got comedy villains, but of course you need a sort of a criminal mastermind at the centre of all this, and who played that criminal mastermind? It was Michael Bentine.
Good grief. I can't imagine that. I can't imagine a bad Bentine.
Well, I never knew who he was. I only heard about Michael Bentine when I discovered the Goons. You know what I mean? I didn't equate the guy that I loved in that TV adaptation of Terry and the Gunrunners. I didn't know his name was Michael Bentine.
Yeah.
Even at that age, I would scour the credits and remember the names of people. His name didn't sort of register with me, but the character I remember very well because it was very over the top kind of almost like South American kind of gangster character that he was playing. But no, I was just say yes. Michael Bentine's radio series would be what I would play to people.
I mean, do you think that somebody who didn't know Spike coming to Q cold would be put off or just utterly confused? Because I know for you, Lisa, Q was never part of your... So you never grew up with Q, did you?
No.
I'm a bit older than you, and I did. And I think you find it quite a hard watch, don't you? Yeah.
I do, yeah.
It is. If you'd asked me that 20 years ago, or 15 years even, maybe, 15, 20 years ago, I'd have said, right, the Best of Q. There was a video that came out in the 80s called The Best of Q.
I had that video.
Yeah. If you'd asked me that back then, I'd have said, watch that, because that's brilliant. Because I used to watch that over and over again. But, yeah, it's it's got a lot of stuff in it now that you would look at and say, I'll just say things like the Pakistani Daleks, things like that.
Yeah.
And certainly, I've got I'm looking at it now. I've got the almost complete queue on DVD, and you can't watch. There's some great stuff amongst it, but a lot of it is just.
A sympathetic edit might be useful with some of these, I think. That's the thing. But it has to be a sympathetic edit, doesn't it? It has to be somebody that knows the material and what you could show and what you necessarily maybe oughtn't to show.
Yes. Yeah. No, I'd love that. Somebody, like you say, sympathetic, who has the right sort of the right thinking, if you like, to put together a decent hour-long compilation of the best of the Q series, which you could, something that you could play at maybe 9 o'clock on BBC4 or something.
I mean, the one I always love is this is the smallest police station in the world. Just silly visual jokes like that.
And the insect one as well, you like, don't you?
The what?
Is that Q? The insects.
Oh, the insects! Stop that clicking. Silly things like that. But but you would need to trim. That's the thing. Yeah, you would need to. I mean,
it's sad as well because there's a number of sketches from the Best of Q video that I used to love, and it's sad to have to say, but you couldn't show them today.
No.
I suppose you could, but it would you just watch them and you kind of cringe, don't you? But watching them, this is the thing, watching them in the 80s when I was 14, 15, it didn't register to me at all that there was any. I mean,
I remember watching that tape and laughing my head off. I do remember just sitting there for however long that tape was and just laughing from start to end. But I've since rewatched it because I think there's probably a copy of it knocking around on YouTube or somewhere. And
there is, yeah.
Yeah, and you can almost hear me sort of going, ooh, every few minutes. So yes. But this material, do you think people are still discovering it? Because I guess the average Goon fan is probably of a certain age and has a certain history with the show. But are people still coming across it, do you find?
You'd be surprised. You'd really be surprised, because I began the show 2 years ago thinking that, it's on my own. So I was thinking every week I'll get a guest. But I was thinking that, okay, where am I going to get my guest? I didn't really know where I was going to get my guest from at that point. I was really sort of, I was out on a limb, and I thought, well, whatever guests I get, they're probably going to be men of a certain age, and they're probably going to be raging against political correctness gone mad, and the fact you can't say this and that, that sort of stereotype. I was thinking that. But what surprised me, and the average age of a guest on Goon Pod, I don't know for definite, but I would say it's people in their 40s. Yeah. So my sort of age, okay, and a lot of people of my generation, and even the generation younger, have discovered the Goons through parents. Yeah. Playing the tapes or CDs or LPs, and I have had guests that are. I mean, the youngest guest I've had is young lady in her early 20s, and she told me of friends of hers, of her, her friendship group, who are into the Goons, and they do Goon fan art.
Oh wow!
Post it online on what do you call it, Instagram and stuff like that.
Yeah.
and it's amazing that there's still, it's not quite. I mean, Hancock has the edge in terms of popularity, but there is still. People are still discovering the Goons. It's not dying with the generation that grew up listening to it, shall we say?
And I guess if you do want to find this material, it is more available now. Because I guess when you started out, you were at the mercy of schedulers, weren't you? Actually being able to get copies of this stuff was hard. I remember the dreadful copies of old TV we used to have, that multi-generation videotape, whereas now with the Goon Show, you've got the restoration work as well, because a lot of the copies that I probably heard were not necessarily the full versions, were they?
No, so Ted Kendall, who I've interviewed, did a fantastic, genius job restoring, putting back in stuff that had been cut out for overseas sales and that, things like that over the years, and restoring them to the best possible quality. And I mean, and BBC Sounds, Spotify, and YouTube, you can listen at the click of a button. You can listen to really good sounding episodes of the Goon Show anytime you want. But when I first was getting into the show, so we're talking 88, 89, it would be repeated every Saturday. They'd play a Goon Show on the national radio station. But there'd be an episode they'd play at 3:00 on Saturday afternoon, which was great. So I could stand by with my tape recorder on pause, and then unpause it the moment Wallace Greenslade says this is the BBC. Okay, but they'd also play an episode on Saturday morning at around about 5:00 in the morning. For some reason. Okay. And so there would be a period where I would be setting my alarm for 4:45, and I would get up and I would go into the lounge where the tape recorder was ready, and I would wait until it began. I'd press record, and then I'd go back to bed, and then I'd listen to the recording when I got up, and it would be a lovely little surprise present for me in the morning. And gradually I amassed a large number of shows, and then I wouldn't have to get up so often because they'd be playing episodes I already had, And then I was buying the tapes, the commercial releases as well, because they were always better quality, because it was a AM channel, national radio, so the quality was never that great.
So in terms of Goon Pod itself, what have been some of your favourite episodes or guests to talk to?
Well, I've been very lucky with some of the guests. Well, all of the guests have been stars. But
that's a good answer.
But I really enjoy. Well, when it began, I would just talk to. Often, I would just get guests on just to talk in general about Goons or Spike or Peter or whatever it may be. But we don't just talk about Goon Show episodes. We will talk about. For anyone who hasn't heard the show, we'll do episodes about films. So slowly working our way through the film career of Peter Sellers. And just yesterday, actually, I recorded an episode about the Spike Milligan film Postman's Knock from 1962. Which he starred in with Barbara Shelley. I'm sure you know Barbara Shelley.
Oh yes, indeed. Yeah.
So it's anything we talk about anything that's got some sort of Goon connection. But I've had some great guests. I've had Griff Rhys-Jones recently, who was marvelous. And okay, we didn't talk about the Goons a lot, to be honest with you, because Griff had such a career. He had a lot to talk about his career as well. But that was really good, because I know a lot about Griff's career because I absolutely adored Les Smith and Jones. Growing up in the 80s, and Not the 9 O'Clock News, and I sort of broke the ice with Griff by asking him, or referring to the Not the 9 O'Clock News sketch in which he plays John McEnroe.
Yes.
I'm sure you know that.
Yeah, that's one. And that's one we used to quote at school. Actually, I remember quoting that.
Yeah, and I think I wrong-footed him. I don't think he was expecting me to kick off with a reference like that. I think he was expecting me just to ask him something pretty bland, formulaic. And because I kicked off with that, he seemed to sort of warmed up, and we had a really great conversation. And I asked him about things like the Two Ninnies sketch,
which has been doing the
Stanley Rogers sketch from Les Smith and Jones, the film score composer, who and drew out of him the fact that he and Mel were supposed to be in an episode of Blackadder the Third, but Mel Mel said he didn't want to do it. So we had a really great conversation. I've had people like David Renwick, writer of Jonathan Crete, One Foot in the Grave, which I adore. He was really great. But also, just shows with friends of mine, with other podcasters, with you guys, of course. There's always something to enjoy, I think. And also, the thing I try to do more than anything is for our conversations not to be too structured or heavily structured. because I do like to meander. I do like to go off on tangents as much as possible, and I really encourage that. and I don't want to just talk about the Goons all the time.
No.
I love talking about just comedy in general. So for some reason, there's been a number of occasions over the course of the series where, for some reason, and I'm not even a big fan, but I've gone off on tangents with guests about Hylda Baker, for God's sake. You know? So, as long as it's a guest who's prepared to buckle in and prepared for the conversation to go any which way, then I see that as a successful episode.
I mean, certainly from our point of view, if you've got somebody on board who's got a decent wide-ranging knowledge, that's absolute gold, because as you say, you can go anywhere with it.
I would say, if I've got someone on who can tell me who Norman Eshley is, that's good enough for me.
That's a good one. Well, we'll wish you good luck with the forthcoming Goon Pods. I'm guessing there's no sign of it ending yet, is there? There's still a hell of a lot to do.
Yes, I've got shows scheduled, at least for recording up until October, but also sort of penciled in for November, December as well, because often I'll do a show built around an anniversary.
Yeah.
So it's, for example, it's the Telegoons 60th anniversary.
Oh, of course it is.
October.
Yes. Oh, blimey.
Which coincides with another anniversary, I believe.
Oh, that old thing. Yeah, that old thing. Yeah. I'm not sure we're going to do anything for that, but you never know. We shall see. So, Tyler, thank you very much for coming on to In Conversation today, and we wish you good luck, and we'll point all our listeners to Goon Pod, where I think they'll have you guys. A great
it's been
time.
Great. And listen, by the way, just want to say the Sykes episode that you came on and talked about with me recently went down a storm. It's one of the most popular episodes.
Oh, that's nice.
So really, really.
Well,
thank you for coming on.
We love doing it. As we said, our knowledge of the Goon Show is not great.
No.
But give us a half-hour comedy to natter about, and we can always come up with something. So. But we enjoyed doing it.
Yes.
So
yes.
Nice to return the favour and have you on here today. So, Tyler, thank you very much, and we'll say ta-ra for the moment. Bye-bye.
Thanks, now. Cheers, guys. Bye.
Bye.